Before I get into the numbers, one of the things I just wanted to make sure was very clear for you all, because we've not had this conversation, I don't believe. We've really been thinking hard in the past couple of years about how we evaluate our effectiveness in locally based climate action. For decades now, we've really been pinning our success to metric tons of carbon. That is the metric that we use. What we have realized, though, is that while it invokes the inner math geek in all of us, it really is not the right proxy to determine whether we're making effective action on climate. And the reason for that, I think, is multi-layered. First of all, when you talk about actual metric tons, it doesn't motivate people. So people aren't inspired to take action by metric tons. No one has ever seen or touched or felt a metric ton. You can't really equate. If I asked any of you, and I won't do it, but we do this game all the time, multiple choice. What is the average emissions for a boulderite? Is it 5 metric tons, 15 metric tons, 500, 5,000? How many people would know? And does that compel them to take any action? And I would argue pretty strongly, no, it doesn't. And which is why we continue to measure our progress in metric tons of carbon. But we also look at the fact that the big levers in terms of emissions reductions are going to happen at a different scale, which is why we really shifted our approach to scales and systems thinking. It's why we are active at the state legislature and the PUC and other regulatory agencies, because the big moves happen when entities like Xcel Energy, who are really the contributors of pollution by burning fossil fuels, they are regulated to do things differently versus us at the local level. We kind of go out and say, just use less of a dirty product, and we don't have any options. So the big levers is really why we try to focus on the systems level change. That doesn't mean that we abandon strategies and tactics that reduce emissions, not at all. It just, we start to build out a spectrum to say individual actions lead to collective actions that then roll up into these big system level changes that are pretty meaningful. But it also allowed us to really prioritize and think differently about our programming. So rather than, people get a little bit hung up on this idea that we should orient our programs to cost per ton. What that means is you can somehow do an algorithm that says $1 invested results in this much reduction in emissions. And it's not that clean. It's not that simple. Many programs take a while to mature. We don't have good data that equates $1 to a metric ton of carbon reduction, as an example. So what we do know from doing this work for a very long time is that we prioritize things like value, so health and safety and economic productivity, and those are all good things, and those are values that our community cares about. And when you orient in those ways, the byproduct typically is a reduction in emissions. So I share all that with you because this year we did do something a little bit different in terms of how we measure our progress and success. So we, again, as I mentioned, since 2005, we've been calculating our greenhouse gas inventory annually, and that just helps share our community's emissions data each year. We measure where our greenhouse gas emissions come from, and we track the community's progress in reducing them. That's what an emissions inventory is really intended to do. And we've matured our inventories since 2005 to really think about the validity of the data. What is it telling us? Is it the right data that we're actually gathering? Are we making assumptions based on that data? And I'm really proud of the fact that we are very rigorous in where we capture that data, how we analyze it, and then really help tell stories from that information rather than just putting out numbers, which I think people don't really connect to, and it doesn't really tell a story. We can start to show how we're investing in different ways based on kind of the wedges of the diagram. Where are our emissions actually coming from? And what are the trends? And what do we know about those trends? As an example, if you look at some of our data over the last 3 years, our inventory tracked what we were seeing nationally, and virtually every city was seeing, is that COVID really did have a profound impact on emissions as it related to electricity and energy consumption, particularly in the commercial and industrial space, and transportation related emissions. And we made some assumptions In 2021, when we saw a pretty significant decline in emissions. Again, this is a trend that the US saw and virtually everywhere saw, that we were pretty sure that the majority of those reductions would not be durable. We would see some kind of rebound effect as people started going back to work. And we needed to see kind of what that COVID hangover would look like. How long would we see those reductions? And what can we tell from those reductions? I'll give you a really quick example of what I'm talking about. Again, transportation-related emissions dropped pretty significantly over the past couple of years. We knew they would rebound as people started coming back to work. We are not all back to work. We still are in a hybrid situation. So why did we see transportation emissions bump up as significantly as they did? Well, what we learned from the data is that people during COVID moved further away. They moved out of the city, they moved to Denver, so they're commuting further. And what we had to dig a little bit into kind of some climate forensics is the impact of RTD service levels had a significant impact on city employees who were commuting in, for example, by bus. If they didn't have the frequency of service, they started driving in on their own. And most people, they were not part of a carpool. And so they were driving single occupancy vehicles into town. And so we did see a spike in transboundary transportation related emissions. We expected it, but not for the reason that we expected it. And so that helps us think through about where do we go now in terms of our funding and our interventions to really address some of those issues. And I think we're going to see that drop back down.
Do you know why people moved?
Well, we did an employee survey, and what we learned from that was we understood the data, but not the reason behind the data. I think there were a number of reasons, as we saw a lot of people kind of go nomadic during COVID. We had people moving out of state and remained city employees. We had people moving to other parts of the state because, again, they had the virtual option to just sit wherever they were and do their work. No one really knew when we would come back, and I think they just kind of gambled that they would still be able to do their work virtually, which they do to some degree. But again, we've switched to 2 days in the office a week as an employer, but we're only one employer within the city. So if you apply this across major employers, I think you can see a pretty dramatic impact. So our inventories, as we do them, follow what's called the Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventories, or GPC. That is the standard, that is the gold standard of how you do greenhouse gas emission inventories. We've been doing that for about a decade, and I am proud to say that over the past 5 years in a row, we have been rated as an A. We've been designated as an A community, so we get the rating of A. From the Carbon Disclosure Project. And what they do is they look at the data that you provide, they look at your methodology, they look at your programming, and of all the cities that do greenhouse gas inventories work through the CDP, there are only 119 cities that get A ratings. And so we've been A rated for 5 years in a row since we've actually started. And it just speaks, I think, to the fact that we take the inventories pretty seriously. We want to make sure we're getting it right, because people need to understand the numbers, and then again, how we're telling good stories from that, and it affects everything we do in terms of our programming. So this past year, we changed a little bit of what we, and please jump in and ask a question to make this as informal as you want. The thing that we did differently this year, and we're always about a year behind because we have to gather data. We go out to the public and private sector to generate information on transportation-related emissions, vehicle miles traveled, cell phone data that helps us with our transportation information, hauler data when it comes to solid waste, our energy information. We have to check and double check and triple check because it's not just usage. We have to look at kilowatt hours used. We have to understand how it's used. We have to back out some things like on-site solar and renewable generation. So we do a lot of work to get the numbers correct. What we did this year that was different in years past is, yes, we did our annual greenhouse gas inventory, and we also do a city operations and facilities inventory. So it looks at what we do as an entity. And we have different goals. We have more aggressive goals as a city entity. So looking at our portfolio of buildings and fleet vehicles and so forth. But the other thing we did this year, if you remember earlier in 2023, Ben Kasmosis from our department gave a presentation on our consumption-based inventory. And if you recall, that was to look more broadly at the impact of emissions from all of the goods and services that we utilize in Boulder. So it pushes further upstream. This was the first year that we launched a dashboard on consumption-based inventories. And then the fourth thing we did, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at, we were talking about it before we started, is kind of coming back to the idea, rather than just putting out numbers and spreadsheets, we wanted to tell stories around impact. And so this was the first year where we launched a climate impact storyboard. It was intended to be a report, and we weren't quite there in report format. So it is a storyboard, and I can show it if we want to get there tonight. But it was a way to look at the impact of our work in ways that were more values-based. So how have we made lives better through our programming? What have we actually accomplished? And many times you can't just quantify that in metric tons of carbon or numbers of certain things. It's more qualitative. So we're starting to get a much better picture of the impact that we're having here locally. And then, sorry, I know I talk a lot on this stuff. I get really excited about it. The other thing that's really important to us is that we continue to build models that we can export. And that's always been part of our DNA in Boulder. We've been at this for a very long time. So we have built models and we have developed methodologies in terms of how we think about climate action that other cities have replicated. And so we try to incubate things and then we push it out. And then really making sure that we are focused in all these different dimensions, as I said earlier, individual actions, collective actions, system scale actions at the state level, federal level, so forth and so on. So we have to use these numbers in our inventories to help us understand where we've been effective and where perhaps we need to make some changes. So I'll dive in, and if you had a chance to look at the information, this won't come as a surprise to you, but I'll just give you some top line kind of what was the result of last year, what do we know, what are the key takeaways from our 2022 emissions inventory.
First question before you dive in.
Yeah, please.
Given the changes that you have all put into this year's cycle, is there a way you have in mind to measure the success of that, where, for example, like using the storyboard or the storyline impact, moving from individual to collective to systemic action? Is there a way to kind of monitor that response in real time, given the new information output? Does that make sense, or I can clarify?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. Well, but let me just check it. Are you saying, is there a way to continue to kind of say, here's the qualitative impact? Is there a way to kind of package it all together in a more real-time way?
As in, no, as in like receptiveness of the community to the information being delivered.
Ah, got it. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We've never had the ability to go out and survey people on the inventory, as an example. It's a pretty wonky document. Although I have to say, if you go out and you search greenhouse gas inventories, community inventories, I kind of do this because I'm always curious to see what people are putting out and how they're telling the story. The majority, I will say 90% plus, most communities put out a spreadsheet. They will say, here are our goals, here's where we started, here's metric tons, here's the percentage change. It doesn't tell a story in any way. Our document tries to do that. It's pretty long, but there's a lot of narrative. It's broken down by sector. It talks about trends. What did we see in changes in methodology, so forth and so on. So we've never really asked people, how are you connected to this inventory? We have quite a few people that we engage with that do use it pretty regularly. They say, hey, we see that emissions are this way and that way. We haven't figured out a way to connect back on the storyboard. And I actually like to think about that because again, it's a website. And so right away, we kind of excluded storytelling to a number of people in our community that we probably should be storytelling with. And maybe there's a different way that we can do that. We have a new communications person that just started yesterday, in fact, 2 days ago. So really eager to explore with her how we can be more present in the community to be able to say, here's our goals, here's our progress, here's where we need you to take some action. How do you connect with this? What ideas do you have? So we're kind of on that trajectory coming out of this couple of years of not really being able to do much engagement. And we have a plan for 2024 to really accelerate.
And then is it her role in terms of getting the storyboard and this, because all the websites, it's amazing. Like, is she gonna get it in front of people? I think I don't know where I found it. I did lots of Googling. But like, how do we make sure people see it?
Yeah, it's so tricky, isn't it? And how do you go beyond, how do you use it as a tool, right? Rather than just say, isn't it interesting? Kind of a one-click scroll through it, some nice pictures, some interesting data, some stories about local residents, and how do you make it real? So we haven't explored that yet. We wanted to get it launched. We put out a big press release. We got a lot of people excited about it. The council was out there talking about the new storyboard. And now we need to resurrect some thinking on where do we go next?
Cool.
Yeah, good questions. Maybe that will be a good topic to come back to the board and discuss with you all. So I can go through the takeaways in as much or little detail as you want. I know that this can get a little bit mind-numbing, and just giving you percentages probably isn't all that meaningful. So what I thought I would do is go through some of the top line takeaways. And then if we want to, I can show you how we push this information out on our website. We have dashboards. We actually have the documents. If you've had a chance to look at the document, I think it's, again, I will tout it. I think it's a really nice read. And then we have our storyboard, and I can put those up on the screen. We can talk about them, but let me just give you some of the high level takeaways, and then we can go wherever you want to go. So the big one is key takeaways from 2022 is that we did see community emissions dropped 18.2% since 2018. So that is meaningful. We saw a slight decrease from 2021, about 2%. So that's not surprising in terms of that comment I made earlier around the durability of some of the emission reductions. You expect kind of not a straight line, but you don't expect a lot of lumpiness in emissions reductions unless you have some big lever that you pull. So a lever that would be Xcel taking a coal plant online and replacing it with some renewable generation. So then you'd see this kind of stair step with these big, like maybe a little bit gradual and then a big drop. We don't expect to see that because most of the emissions are from factors that we don't necessarily control, like electricity and natural gas being used for the production of electricity or in heating and industrial processing. So
what was the number? Since 2018, you said?
So from 2018, we've reduced emissions just over 18%.
18%.
Yep. So if you looked at any of that chart, and I'm happy to pop it up there, you saw that we're seeing this good decrease year over year.
Do you mind popping up?
No, absolutely.
Just under the city of Boulder, right?
This is the community.
Like Boulder County or just city of Boulder?
Just city.
Just city. Okay.
So bear with me for a second. Get to the dashboard. We actually had this queued up. That's tempting fate trying to share a screen, but it seems like it worked.
Cool.
Okay. So, and Greg, for your benefit, I'll kind of talk through what's on the screen. What I have up is one of 3 dashboards that we have on our website. This is our community GHG or greenhouse gas emissions data dashboard. And each of the dashboards are part of a larger package that the city tracks. So we have a whole series of things that are on our dashboard, but we also have one that is renewable energy generation. We have a specific target there. So we have a dashboard on that. We have dashboard on transportation related issues. But as you click through this, gives a little bit of a definition of when we talk about emissions, where are they coming from and why do we care about them? The next item, of course, is our targets. So our newest targets that backstop all of this is to reduce emissions 70% by 2030 against that 2018 baseline. So Hernan, you asked, we're at 18%. So we have a ways to go. We have to accelerate. We know that. But we also know that, I want to just emphasize this point, there is this kind of difference of opinion around how you establish goals. Are they measurable? Can we actually do it? And I would argue that I think we took a lot of heat, no pun intended, when we established these goals. A lot of people said, well, how in the world are you going to show me the roadmap? How are you actually going to achieve that significant level of decrease in emissions? What I will say is that we have ideas on how we're going to do that. Many of them sit at the state level, which is why we are putting a lot of emphasis on the utility right now. Because as we come back to what we know is that the majority of our emissions come from electricity generation. We are getting cleaner for sure, but we can accelerate as we start to see a lot of those fossil fuel generation units come offline, replaced with renewables. So we're going to see some acceleration. We know that, and then we have ideas on how to address some of the other numbers that are going to be in here that I'll show you. So our goals, again, reduce emissions 70% by 2030 against a 2018 baseline, become a net zero city by 2035, and carbon positive by 2040. How we're going to do those two, those are much more challenging. We don't necessarily know how technology is going to play a role. We have to think about the policies. So we are forecasting and trying to make sure we're on a trajectory now, so we're not waiting. The trend. So this is what I wanted to show you. This is what I was just talking through. So our community-wide emissions decreased 2% from 2021, but we're 18% below our 2018 baseline. When we talk about baselines, that is the year at which we start the measurement. When we first began this, it was 2000. First of all, it was 1997. That was our Kyoto Protocol. The next kind of milestone was 2005. Most cities continue to use a 2005 baseline. We updated it to 2015 and then to 2018 because it is more honest, it's more relevant, and it's harder. If you look at our numbers, we have reduced emissions 36% over 2005 numbers. So we are on the right trajectory for sure, but we want to continue updating that baseline to make sure that we are tracking in the right way. So not surprisingly, the trend in terms of our largest sources of emissions are electricity use, natural gas use, on-road transportation, and aviation. Those are the four big ones for us as a community. Yes.
Aviation question, is that about the Boulder Airport specifically, or is this like
travel? That is travel of all of us
travel
getting on airplanes
Okay.
at DIA. And that is one of the, oddly, we actually do have good data from that. And so we do have to make some assumptions on air travel. And some of that is in, if you go into the inventory, the actual inventory, it talks about the methodology of how we actually capture that. So here are, now you're looking at the actual graph, and you can see where we are, and this is the dashboard. So you can see on the left-hand side are our emission reductions against that 2018 baseline. You can see where we are there and getting to that 70%. And then that the number I just mentioned to you on the right side, that's emission reductions against the 2005 baseline. So you can see how those two things differ a little bit.
How do you measure these emissions?
I don't understand the question.
How do you measure like greenhouse gas emissions, like from the grid, or how do you know the numbers?
Yeah, so good question. And I would encourage you, the actual inventory, it has the methodology of where we get the information. So as an example, when we talk about energy, so we know what our consumption is in terms of kilowatt hours. So we know in our community, here's how many kilowatt hours we have consumed. Then you pair that with a grid factor. So what we know is what is the renewable percentage and the percentage of fossil fuels in that mix of energy. And this is something that Xcel has to provide by statute. So they actually have to show, in order to meet their legislated emission reductions as a utility, they have to show what their grid factor is. So what is the carbon intensity of their electricity? So you do some simple math to say, if we consume this amount of electricity, here's our grid factor. What is the resultant emissions from consuming electricity? That's a simplistic way of looking at it, because then you have to look at, we have solar on rooftops. Does that just reduce the demand? In most cases, yes, but there is net metering. So as electricity flowing back out onto the grid, it's a smaller amount. So how do you calculate that? So we have a whole methodology to get to an emissions factor for energy. Then you look at BTUs or therms of gas usage. We also have that information. So we start to look at what, and that gets a little bit trickier because we don't just have one gas provider. There are actually multiple gas providers. Xcel owns the infrastructure, but we don't know where that gas comes from. Some companies will say that there is some biogas or some environmental elements to their gas, which we just don't necessarily buy into. So then you look at how much gas is being used, and you look at the grid factor, excuse me, the carbon factor there. Then you get your heating load, you get your emissions coming from heating buildings. Transportation is much more sophisticated than it used to be. We just used VMT data, vehicle miles traveled, and then we would look at where travel patterns where people were commuting to and from. We would say, and we still do this, if you are driving, let's say from Louisville, we capture half of that travel. And Louisville will take half of that, and for their inventory, if they do an inventory, they do, but yeah, and we'll take half of that. Then you start to look at,
carpool, like how's that folded in?
yeah, so we get all this information from our transportation department. It's not perfect, but we have really gotten to a place that we trust the data. So you look at actual vehicles that are registered in Boulder County. You start to look at a lot of information to make some assumptions about carpooling, as an example. Now what cities are doing is actually using a software called Streetlight. It's the stupidest name, I'll tell you, but it actually uses cell phone data. So just as we are all tracked on our phone for multiple purposes, we also use, there's a firm that does this for many cities, and they use cell phone information to be able to track commute patterns and how long and far people are driving. So then we start to, very similar, you start to make assumptions about the vehicles, where people are going, looking at mileage, and then you get basically the similar type number in terms of carbon intensity of our travel. Then you start to look at where our waste is going. So you go deeper and deeper into each of these in terms of methodology, but I went too long on that one. I could have just said all of that is in the inventory report, but I'd love for you to take a look at it and see what it's telling you in terms of process. Yeah.
In short, given that, do you have an idea of what the percentage error is, like the 2% decrease since 2021? Is that about what the error is on collecting all this data? Is that still like a significant change?
It is significant.
Okay.
Yeah, it is significant. I think that we've been doing this long enough that we're pretty confident in our numbers.
Okay.
What this doesn't do, and this gets back to my opening comments about the usefulness of carbon or metric tons of carbon to really track progress. That's why we're doing the consumption-based inventory. So if you looked at any of the information, our analysis showed that it was about let's see, 1.4 million metric tons to 1.6 million metric tons. So about 200,000 metric tons that we weren't accounting for in consumption-based activities. That's significant. So each year we do it, we try to refine and be more honest in telling the story about, you know, some cities will just look at kind of the bubble. They'll just put a bubble over their city. They only do scope 1, which is electricity, transportation, maybe waste. And they make good progress, right? Xcel will clean up their grid. They can show that they've made significant improvements in their emissions. they're not doing the upstream emissions calculations. We are doing that because it's the right thing to do. So it's a really interesting question. I think, just so you hear my answer, the 2%, I'm going to say again, I think is significant.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so here's that trend that I was referencing. And you can see from 2005, the gradual decrease. You see the big drop between 2019 and 2020. That was anticipated. 2021 fully expected the rebound. Ours was not as significant, quite frankly, as a lot of cities. Many saw a big drop and then a huge spike back beyond where they were in 2019. So honestly, we were comfortable and pretty happy with the results. We expected 2022 to actually continue to rebound a little bit higher. And so when we saw that there actually was a decrease in 2022, we were pleased with that. And we're going to see that I anticipate that we're going to see the trajectory going back down on that same trend line that you saw, that you can see from 2005 down to 2019 effectively. Then we're actually going to see some pretty significant drops over the next 5 to 7 years as a direct result of a lot of our actions at the state. A lot of the carbon intensity of our grid power is going to be significantly changed over the next 5 to 7 years as we see some of the coal and gas plants retired. So that'll be a big shift here. That doesn't suggest, though, that we have a big issue to address in terms of transportation related emissions. We know that not only is it becoming a bigger piece of the pie as energy gets smaller, the actual emissions are not going down at the pace that we want them to. So we have some work to do there.
Out of curiosity, will you guys be keeping track of, since RTD changed their fare structure? Is that considered a knob to monitor, or a kind of a start date to monitor to see?
Yes.
Did they go up?
No, it's decreased like the
Yeah.
regional fares, and I think you can drive to under 18 for free.
Oh, nice.
And we did look at, we worked with RTD to understand the impact of their zero fare program this past summer. What did that do to ridership? And could we calculate some type of emissions data from that? Were people getting out of their cars onto the bus? Always, you have to be careful with the assumptions that you make, but I think it's interesting data points.
Hey, Jonathan.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so, you said that there's a decrease by 2%. And so is that make it so that we would be reaching our 2030, 2035, 2040 objectives, or do we need to get to 2.5? How are we doing with those objectives?
Yeah, no, really good question, Greg. So the current trajectory is not sufficient to meet our 2030 goal. We are going to have to accelerate, and this is not unexpected, which is why it is helpful to look at the information and say, where can we intervene and how do we start to steepen the curve to get from 2022 to 2030? And I want to say this, not in a pedantic kind of way, but it's also important to say that we set the goal. We established our goal,
Sure.
Our 2030 goal, based on what science is telling us we need to establish, global. I mean, it's a global scientific target. It's not just a city target. But I want to say that we are really working hard to hit that target. And if we make it close, I don't call that a failure. I think it's success because, again, so many of the factors that control our emissions are outside of our direct control. So I think the trend is a positive one. I think there are a lot of things that we need to be doing to accelerate, to steepen the curve. And we know what those things are. And we've been setting up for those big moves for many years now. And that's why I made that comment that we're going to see a steepening over the next 5 to 7 years. I am confident, I'm going to say this, I am confident that we're going to hit our targets. And I don't say that because I have to say that. I say that because I honestly believe it.
Yeah. a follow-up question then is, are some of those things that you're planning, does it talk about like, what is a per capita energy use need to drop or carbon drop per person? Like, what am I at in Boulder? If I live in Boulder, on average, we use this much, and by per person, we need to get, to this much. Is there any kind of information like that?
Yes, it's all in our inventory. It actually, we break it down by community-based emissions and per capita. And then where do we need to be in terms of absolute metric tons of carbon equivalent as a community and per capita. So that's all in. I can pull it up if you want the number right now. Or I'll just send it to you. I can pull it out and send it to you directly if that's helpful.
Yeah, later we'll talk about it. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Let me do this then. Let me switch. Is there any other, do you have any other questions on the community inventory? Yeah, Hernan, please.
So what are these numbers compared to the, like, maybe the county or the US? I remember when like we had a discussion like this one a couple years ago. I think we were better than the US average. Is that trend still the same or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, and when you say better, do you mean?
I think we have reduced, I'm trying to remember because it was a couple of years ago, I think, like we have reduced our emissions.
Yeah.
From 2005 or something like that, maybe 25%, whereas the US average was like 15,
correct,
18 or something. So we were like ahead or forwarding our goals. So I was wondering if the trend still continues with this new data.
Yes, but it does, but as we continue to refine our methodology, which is why I keep coming back to the idea of consumption-based inventories, right? So if we're starting and saying, if we just did scope 1, I mean, we'd be crushing it. We'd be knocking it out of the park, but that's not honest accounting. That's when we started to look at, okay, let's do scope 1, scope 2, let's do scope 3, let's look at everything. Now let's start to look at consumption-based emissions. So what the result of that is that our emissions, we keep stacking more on top that we have to reduce, which again is the right thing to do. This trend line is very normal. This is what you're seeing in most communities. Although, as I mentioned earlier, I think many saw a much larger bump up in 2021 and 2022 than we did, which is good. But in terms of per capita, yeah, we're doing great. We still have work to do on the transportation related emissions for sure. That's going to be the one that we really need to solve for.
But it's more of a regional problem too, right?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it gets very messy because it also becomes a land use issue and a housing issue, and it all gets tangled up in a very complex algorithm. And so it's not as easy to say we got to get people out of their cars. Yes, it is, but we have to solve the fundamental problems that kind of result in more transportation related emissions.
Okay.
I wanted to. These are great questions, by the way. Thanks, and I'm happy to. I'm happy to go as long as you want on this, but I wanted to go to the next one here. Okay, city operations. Similar to the community emissions, I wanted to show you our target is a little bit different though. So we had a 50% reduction by 2020 target and an 80% reduction by 2030. That tracks with the community. But we are working off a 2008 baseline. We need to update that, but we're still working on some internal information so we can actually do that accurately. So our trend has been positive. We reduced total emissions from city operations and facilities 43%. Between 2008 and 2022. So I would highlight this next sentence, which means that we honestly believe that we can achieve our targets by 2030. And we think we can do it a little bit sooner. One of the challenges that we have been facing, of course, is we don't own all of the buildings. We have buildings that are old, that are not as efficient as they should be. So we've been doing a lot of work, and in fact, tomorrow night, council will get an update on the facilities master plan, talking about how if we really start to orient our decisions around maintaining our buildings from a climate perspective, we would make decisions differently than we are today. And that is the direction we are going in as an organization pretty significantly. So really starting to say, what would it look like to reduce emissions in our building portfolio? How would you do that? It might mean selling off some of our inefficient buildings and replacing them, looking at embodied carbon. So starting to really think more holistically about our building portfolio. Yeah.
When you're talking about, selling off inefficient buildings, is part of the conversation at all, like responsibility of the owner and who's going to say, we were talking about deconstruction. I don't know if that was last time, but
It was.
recently, if the city would try to handle that building in a more climate effective, energy efficient way, as opposed to selling off and someone else using it in a less effective way, is that part of the conversation at all? Or is it, we're just trying to hit the city target and once it's off our
No.
hands?
No, because again, I think what we're trying to create is more of a community culture around our building portfolio. Using our building codes as a great example. So I'll answer it this way. There are a few things that are affecting how we think about our overall portfolio of buildings. We are campus style. Obviously, we have a number of buildings in the downtown area. We have a number of buildings that we either lease or rent and don't own. We have many that are slated for to go away because they're in the floodplain in this downtown campus area, as an example. So that's why there's been such momentum to consolidate, and the Alpine Balsam, the old hospital site, is where all of the majority of our operations are going to be centrally located by 2027. So what does that mean in terms of the buildings that we're leaving behind? If we don't own them, someone else is going to lease them. Do we want to sell them? Do we want to think about who we sell them to and what purpose they're going to be used for? Do we want to do the upgrades that are necessary now if they are going to have some life expectancy still in them? These are all conversations that council will be talking a little bit about tomorrow night.
Cool.
Yeah. Just really quickly, I did want to flag a couple of things on our citywide information. We were a little bit surprised. So we knew that we had an issue with some inefficient buildings. We saw an uptick in emissions from energy use. Here, I can show you that trend line here. But I mean, you can see the trend is pretty significant in that downward trajectory. So that's not necessarily the concern. We did see an increase in transportation related emissions. Again, not surprising, but it was a bigger increase than we anticipated. Going back to the comment I made earlier, again, like, why is that? I don't understand. We have more people driving electric vehicles. We're electrifying our fleet. We have a commitment to do so. And it really came down to what I said earlier, employees moving further away, commuting further, not having transit opportunities. So we did see a spike in transportation emissions from in-community and transboundary transportation as city employees. So helpful information. So now we start to think with our colleagues in transportation how we want to address that. Okay. Again, these documents, the actual full reports are on our website. Feel free to dig into them. They'll put you right to sleep. Actually, they don't. I think they're
That's great.
Back to the plot.
fascinating.
Jonathan, could you go back to the plot you had before?
So which one?
The last plot you were showing, the one with the city organization emissions.
This one here?
Yeah, it almost seems like it might, like it's, the slope is like different. So the reduction is like the acceleration of the, like,
Asymptotic.
yeah, like it's almost like it could plateau, you know?
Well, I mean, it did slow. I think that's, if you look at this graph right here, and Greg, what this is showing is specific emissions from buildings, employee commute, materials, solid waste, streetlights and traffic signals, vehicle fleet, and water and wastewater treatment. So if you look at each of those lines, you can see some of those trends over time. And they're not decreasing like we thought they were going to decrease. And in fact, some of them just popped up a little bit. So that's, I think, the interesting thing is you dissect. But very similarly, we use the same energy as our community uses. So we're going to see some of those big drops coming up relatively soon. And we do what we can do as we really prioritize efficiency and conservation of energy in our own buildings. We electrify our fleet more. We start to electrify our buildings more. Really driving gas out of our building portfolio when we own the buildings. So we're going to see that really start to drop a lot quicker.
Wait, didn't you say transportation ticked up? But that's the purple line didn't.
This does not show, there, sorry, there, now you can see it.
Oh, yeah.
I just realized it was only on the screen to 2020. Yeah, so if you look at that bottom line, you see that, the purple line down there at the very bottom.
Got it.
That is your employee commute and business travel. That's the one that went up, and then that orange line in the middle, that's materials. Just because there was a hiatus on a lot of some upgrades and some building stuff that was done, but those go up and down pretty regularly. How we doing? Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
I don't need to get too far into this one, but I did want to just show you a couple more spots on our dashboard. Get back down here. So here's that consumption-based inventory. A lot of details here. Specifically, when you start on the overview, Ben worked on this for quite a while, so you can understand how the things flow together. How does the consumption-based inventory relate to our overall community-based inventory? Lots of good graphics here that I believe he shared with all of you. So looking at what's in, what's out of that scope. What I wanted to show you, there we go. This is that, and I'm going to test whether I got this right. We were talking a little bit earlier about the 2% and that margin of error, and I just wanted to come back to that because the consumption-based inventory really highlighted that a typical Boulder household, not per capita, but a household, is responsible for around 38 metric tons of CO2 annually. There is a per capita there, about 17.5 metric tons per person. So that gives you this idea of what's attributable to residents in Boulder. So this takes out the commercial and the industrial piece. This is just people. So what that shows is you compare that to our traditional inventory. What you see is that a total carbon footprint of 1.4 million versus 1.6. So there's that difference in terms of the calculation. We're accounting for more emissions than we were previously when we start to look at that upstream impact. So some key takeaways, not surprising, and I don't need to go into these. I think Ben talked about these a little bit. It seems like it differs, but it really doesn't. Transportation, food, and services are the largest overall categories. But if you look at what that means, so again, transportation tracks as we expected. Housing is just household energy use, home construction maintenance, the things that we buy for our homes, materials that go into buildings, all of that kind of stuff. The food one was interesting, and I think it was a little bit surprising, and we have some thought to do around that one. So this is not just food miles traveled, but really thinking about diets. And we typically try to stay away from that argument and trying to tell people what they should and shouldn't eat, but I think giving people the information and data is really important. So this gives a good sense of emissions coming from agriculture, forestry, land use changes, specific diets. And so we try to incorporate that information. EcoData Labs had to make some assumptions there, but again, Boulder and Boulder County, we both did this consumption-based inventory. And then there's this discussion about goods and services, emissions attributable to those kind of things. And I believe we do have a dashboard. There it is. The dashboards look a little bit different on the consumption-based inventory. So you can look at household emissions per capita and then how emissions are changing based on those different sectors here. And I'm just kind of flowing. This was the one I remember you all had some interesting feedback on. I don't think I can zoom that in all of the way. But these are all those categories broken down into transportation, housing, food, goods, and services, and what each of those means. So, transportation is air travel, vehicle expenses, vehicle purchases, gasoline. So that's the gray bar on the left. So you can break it down even further from just saying transportation related emissions. And it's kind of fascinating to see where the big chunks are. So
I have a question about transportation that
yeah,
is very broad, but
Yeah.
given the amount that Coloradans and Boulderites tend to drive to outside adventure activities as opposed to work, is there like any way that information can be gathered of what is transportation for like commuting purposes as opposed to going
Recreation.
skiing or, yeah?
I believe so. Our transportation department gathers transportation data. They are very sophisticated in how they do it. Let me check and see if they have broken it down that way.
Yeah, because I'd be curious, because I know they have like things like the Snow Staying or CU runs the bus and like, if we knew that information, would that help change any approaches to transportation reduction?
Yeah, it's interesting because most of the transboundary emissions are from commuting, and we get that information. Obviously, it's like people coming in the morning, leaving at night versus, kind of the more recreational based travel. So I'd be curious to see what they have on that. Yeah, happy to dig into that. All right, I promise I'm almost done. Thanks for being attentive and listening to me ramble on.
Thanks for answering our questions. Yeah.
What's that?
Thanks for answering our
Oh,
questions.
these are good questions. Oh, let me do this really quickly too. There we go. This is the other one.
We're geeking out too, so
What's that, Greg?
we're geeking out as well.
Oh, I'm
At least I
glad.
am.
Okay, I don't feel guilty.
Yeah.
I wanted to show you on the dashboard, there are a couple others that I thought you might be interested in while I'm here. So there's our zero waste diversion data dashboard. So you can see, again, trends there and our path to zero waste. We're there at 51%. But Greg, similar to your question earlier, kind of on the per capita, this dashboard breaks it down, pounds of residential waste per day, pounds of commercial waste. You can see some really interesting trends in some of the graphs that are on here in terms of annual waste diversion by streams. And this is going to be interesting and to help understand the impact of the changes that we had to make to our organic stream. So we'll get into this updated relatively soon. And then the other one that is on here that just kind of blew me away. We set this target with no clear, I had to be honest with council when we did. I'm like, I don't know if we can do this. Let's try it and let's see where we go. This is our local renewable energy generation dashboard. So how much local generation is actually installed capacity in city limits. And if you can see that number, that is 84. That is a huge amount of renewable generation installed in a city our size.
That's awesome.
I mean, like by orders of magnitude more than what you would expect. So our target was 50 megawatts by 2020. We easily surpassed that. And our next target is 100 by 2030. We're at 84. And we have no doubt we're going to sail past that probably in about 2 years.
Right.
So that tells a really interesting story too. Okay. So the last piece that I just wanted to talk through, and maybe since I sent this to you, do you want to pull up the storyboard, or I'm gonna have to like
No, I can share.
I can do it. I also have to search for it. I just happen to have that one on. So let me stop my share. This won't take long. No, look at that, ready to go. So I just wanted to highlight this for you as well. As I mentioned, this idea of how do we measure our impact? How do we tell a good story? So this is the storyboard that we created and launched in November. As I mentioned, we still have some work to do in thinking about how often do we update it. How do we make sure people find it useful and go back to it? How are people connecting to it? How is it motivating them? But we just wanted to get it launched, frankly. And I'm really excited by the stories that it's telling, because again, we wanted to put in some videos and testimonials and really show how our work is having a pretty significant impact. I'm just gonna keep talking.
Sorry, yes, please do, thank you.
No,
It
I-
keeps switching my screens on me, so I have to fix that really quick.
Totally fine, totally fine. So what we will probably do this upcoming year is actually develop more of a report out of this that we can actually start quantifying, putting in some of the qualitative metrics, some quantitative metrics, and align it with the city's SARE framework, which is our Sustainability, Equity, and Resilience framework. So looking at some strategic goals, how the city is really orienting around those things and how we're supporting it. So when you go here, if you want to you can just scroll a little bit right there. So you can see those headers: getting started, who we are, impact at a glance, climate justice, making climate action easier, sustainability in businesses. So these are kind of the headers there. So if you just click on, for example, climate justice, Heather, just one. This talks about why climate justice is so important. It links to our racial equity plan. And then we give examples of how we are supporting that outcome through our work. So talking about recovering from climate disasters, disproportionately impacted community members, why we are orienting our funding and resources in this way, and what's the impact of that. So as you flow down, I think there's maybe one more page. You can actually see here, then we have some quotes and some actual dashboard information about the number of homes that have actually been repaired through our climate funds, the number of projects, and we've already done probably 20 or 30 more since then. And then we talk about how we engage in standards, codes, policy work to achieve some of those outcomes. So anyway, spend some time if you're bored, poke around on the storyboard. Love to hear your thoughts, any input, any thoughts you have to make it better. And this question that you asked, which is how do we make it relevant and accessible to everybody? How do we make it a tool, I guess is the point. Yeah, so there's a lot in here. Our solar grants, reducing energy burden. That's really been our metric. How do you reduce burden?
Yeah.
So a lot of good information here, and it's a great place to kick off from. So I just threw a lot at you, realizing I probably should have done a PowerPoint now to give you all something to look at.
I appreciate the informality for asking questions though.
Okay. So what does this bring up for you? Any broad questions, any lingering things that you want to talk more about? Yeah, I'll just stop talking.
I'm curious, do you know how transportation is planning to take on some of these problems?
Yeah, so the transportation master plan is, regularly updated, and traditionally, the approach has been looking at strategies that reduce VMT. And that's not always aligned with reducing emissions or congestion, meaning strategies that reduce VMT might increase emissions, or vice versa. You could reduce emissions and increase VMT. So what is the metric that you really want to target? So as you start looking at solutions like more TNCs, Ubers and Lyfts on regular routes, for example, you might see more VMT because you have cars that are just kind of circling all day long, but they're EVs, reduces congestion because there's fewer cars. It just happens to be that car is on the road all day long. So I'm just giving you examples of how that kind of creates an interesting tension. But we've been having a lot of really good conversation and alignment between transportation and the climate department to really think about how do we think about this hierarchy, which has always been looking at strategies like 15-minute neighborhoods. How do we look at multimodal transportation options? If you look at those as outcomes, similarly saying, well, how do we reduce emissions? How do we reduce congestion? How do we get people traveling less to the places that they need to be? Micromobility, land use conversations, fleet electrification. And so this hierarchy of, if you have to drive electric, but that doesn't mean that we don't jump to driving. It's what are all of those other options, getting people to use alternative modes of transportation first and foremost. So that's all still built into the transportation master plan. And now we're starting to build out kind of these other modules that are really climate and resilience based. So I would say stay tuned for how we're really going to move in this space, but I would say we've done the hardest part, which is creating that alignment where there hasn't been a ton. And that's not a criticism, it's just been the transportation master plan's been in place for a very long time and has really been anchored and rooted in its specific objectives.
How does the transportation master plan work with like housing and density? Because that part, do they include that when they're talking about transportation in terms of?
Yes, but very similar to what I just said, I think we're starting to see how critical those connections really are.
Yeah.
Where it's really shown up is more around transit development, thinking about the idea of, are we designing our buildings and our roads for cars? Are we designing our roads and buildings for people?
Right.
And how does that kind of connect in terms of development patterns and requirements and code versus behavior?
Right.
And how do we want to think about driving the behavior that we want? So parking is a great example. Full contact sport in Boulder, no question. Land use and parking, the two things like, whew. But we're starting to see how connected each of these areas is to one another.
Right.
You can't talk about land use without talking about housing.
Right.
You can't talk about housing without talking about climate. You can't talk about climate without talking about open space. So finding how connected those pieces are, where we have been kind of utilities, you guys do your thing, transportation, you guys are responsible for your master plan and roads and stuff, and climate, you guys do whatever you do over there.
Mhm.
And now we've really created some really powerful alignment, more than I have ever seen. And
That's great.
it's really just in the past year or two. So we're starting to kind of work together across the departments for kind of these strategic purposes.
Cool.
It's exciting.
Yeah, Jonathan, I have a question about the interconnectedness of it all. And that is that, like, a lot of us in Boulder buy all these new EVs and the electric bikes and all the things that we buy from Amazon. And so I'm just curious, is there accounting for how much does it cost to replace my gas powered engine, car with an electric vehicle now? Like, I'm getting rid of, some old stove and replacing it with a new one. Or how is the carbon counted for that kind of activity?
Yeah, Greg, it's a good question. If I understand what you're asking, there are a number of ways. First of all, when you look at some of the big items, right, in terms of embodied carbon, we don't have a methodology necessarily to say, hey, Greg, we need you to tell us like what model of stove you're getting rid of, so we can go research the embodied carbon in that stove and make sure we account for that. What we are accounting for is what you're buying. That we have the ability to start to track a little bit more effectively. So it's not perfect at all.
How do you do that?
Huh?
I mean,
I can't
how do
tell you,
know?
we're the government. No, not necessarily with stoves, but we make some big assumptions, and that's what's built into that consumption-based inventory. And this is new space for every community. We are kind of pioneering this work of how do we calculate the goods that people are buying? What are they buying? Are they appliances? Are they just more knickknacks for your shelves? I mean, what are you buying from Amazon? How many trips is Amazon making? What's the carbon that we need to account for in those goods. So right now, there's been a lot of data collection in conjunction with Amazon and others, and then we're extrapolating that data. EcoData Labs has access to kind of that algorithm to say, all right, generally speaking, we know the amount of say Amazon activity in Boulder. How they get that, I'm not quite sure. To figure that out. And then they start to tease out a little bit of assumption. So we can say, here are the estimated emissions from the stuff that we are buying upstream. We are only a year into this. No one has really done this. A few cities are maybe a year ahead of us, but still wrestling with that same issue.
Okay. So then do you, like was it just last month that we were talking about, like the trash that's going into our waste, and you told me some number, or told us numbers, and like if we're producing so much waste, you could use that and compare it to another city.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yes. Yeah, that's where the per capita information is pretty helpful versus total.
Right. Okay.
But you do raise an interesting point that we always try to struggle with, right? Which is, and we're an affluent community, so buying a bunch of EVs, well, great. So what about the vehicles that you're getting rid of? How do we want to account for that? And there's no perfect solution, right? I mean, there is embodied carbon in building new EVs, no question. We have to deal with second life battery applications. It's a new kind of pioneering area that we can think about. Which is why, we just want to tell people, go out and buy a bunch of electric cars and electric bikes. It's consuming more and more stuff. So trying to balance, and like that comment I made earlier, if you have to drive electric. So we're trying to think about ways to talk to the community that give a little bit of a hierarchy of needs and good decision making, but it's a tough one.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't want to be accused of social engineering.
Do people know, like, okay, I've got this gas powered car, is the offset of lower carbon of having an electric vehicle, is that a net positive or net negative than just keeping my old car and not buying a new one? Like that would be information that I think people would want to know. What's the cost analysis? Both in my budget monetarily, but also full carbon accounting.
Well, you can get really wrapped around the axle, though. Depends on the car, how long you're going to keep it.
Right.
Yeah, it gets really tricky. So we try not to go into that level of detail. If people are armed and they ask questions, and we try to help them with some analysis. But sure, that's a good point. Makes my head spin.
Okay. And that seems like it'd be a good thing to investigate, so that would, help us as citizens know, should I? Like, because I keep hearing things like that, like, news articles about EVs are not all that great, and because, there's all these costs, and yet we're trying to reduce the carbon. So what do I do? What do I do?
You want someone to tell you?
Well, and obviously nobody's going to be able to tell me exactly, because it's not easy, like you're saying. But I think a lot of people have that kind of question of how do I even start to think about it? Because if it blows our mind, then obviously it's going to blow somebody's mind who's doesn't think about this all the time, doesn't geek out on it.
Wouldn't surprise me if that was like an ongoing research
It is.
project in many places.
It is.
Probably.
Because all I will say to that is that we need to work hard to help people make good choices and feel like they are part of creating solutions. But the tension is in terms of the magnitude of the impact. That's why I keep coming back to we want to support individual actions. how do we then think about what is a collective action in terms of EV purchases and getting rid of old internal combustion engines? Collective action, what impact would that have? How do we go to the system scale and change the rules, right? We talked about this in terms of like waste, like we're always dealing with the waste on the back end. Why don't we go to the producers and say, stop making the crap? So changing the system on the front end is so critical. And it's that whole spectrum that we've really centered ourselves into making sure that we're supporting, but it's tricky.
Yeah, like, I mean, if you have wondered about a way of looking at the expected lifetime, the lifespan of a product, whether it's a single-use coffee cup, or grocery bag, to a couch that you keep for 20 years versus some little table that some college student comes and buys, and 3 years later it's out in the dump or in the trash or whatever.
Mhm.
I have one final question that
Sure.
may take maybe more than a moment, but so one of the metrics on there that was pretty high is water and like the water treatment plant. And that seems to be moving more to the community beyond the individual side of things. Do you know what actions can be taken in that arena that help reduce those numbers?
Yeah, the
That'd be like
emissions,
more driven more by the efficiency of the water treatment plant
Yes.
specifically? Did
Yes.
we relatively recently make upgrade stars?
we did. So this is illustrated, I think, in the report. There were some significant construction projects. And we accounted for emissions from those activities.
Okay.
And the energy, is our biggest energy user for sure. And so that's why we saw a spike there.
Okay.
Another great alignment between us and our utilities department, really strong synergy, really looking at ways to align around energy use and overall emissions. So yeah, good flag.
Okay, guys, I would like to wrap up this conversation so we have time to discuss next item.
Great.
So thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate the update. It was very informative. Lots of numbers. It was nice. So yeah, the next item is our annual letter to council, and this is basically an opportunity for us as a board to tell the decision makers at the city level what we think their priorities should be. So I don't know if you had the chance to see letters from previous years, but we usually talk about policies and goals. And this year, I would like it to be a little bit more action focused. So Jonathan, do you mind giving a little overview of this process and how it's worked in the previous years, and I guess what the whole thing entails?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to make it super quick since you listen to my voice a lot tonight. So each year, City Council asks for a letter, which is basically a summary of your recommendations as a board to council. So what they're looking for is, here are the priorities that you recommend council take up for their next 2-year work program. So remember the audience right there, policymakers. What they do then is they get their letters from each of the boards, and they take those and they may, a council member may say, oh, I really like what I'm seeing from TAB, Transportation Advisory Board, or if I'm from the EAB. And I want to advance that as one of my key priorities in the council retreat, which will be held in March. Remember, this is usually write the letter in the fall because the retreat is typically in January. They've changed the cadence. It's going to be in March. So a couple of points that I would suggest for you all as you think about your letter this year, and that is, really prioritize this idea that they are policymakers. The way boards have sometimes used their letter is to direct a work program within a particular department. I'm not opposed to that at all. I just don't think it's an effective use of your voice. We can have a conversation, and if you say, hey, I would love to see you all think about this in your work program, let's talk about that. Versus going to council to then tell Nuria to tell me. It just is not efficient. and amplifying your voice in terms of, hey, these are things that are large priorities for our community that we as the Environmental Advisory Board recommend council take up as a priority. Those could be things that are cross-departmental. They may be things that ultimately flow down and we as a department, as the Climate Initiative Department, oversee, but environmental issues obviously are not just subject to my department. They cover so many different departments. And so my recommendation is thinking about those items that would really be cross-cutting, that would be high enough level so it's not just a work program item, but you might illustrate to say the result of this thing could be these things that are work program items in the next 2 years. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, I've sent 3 letters to council so far. And I felt like, I think one of my goals now as chair was to be more specific. Like in previous years, the way those letters were directed, to me, they were a little generic. Like a priority for the board is air quality, right? I feel like, yeah, air quality is important, but it's also like kind of like the jurisdiction of the county. And there were no specific action items for the council to be like, okay, council, do this. It was more like, we cared about air quality. It's so important, which, yeah, it's important, but it's one of the things that they will read and be like, okay, yeah, neat, air quality is important, but there were no like steps for them to do, or decisions to make, or recommendations to make to staff. It was a little too just big goals without specific questions for them to answer or actions to take. So I think, you know, I think my goal as chair now will be to kind of direct the group to work more on action items and things that the council can actually make decisions on, and then, you know, talk to Nuria and then make it, you know, Nuria distribute the work across departments, including the climate initiatives one. And I think for that, we will need some guidance, because I don't know exactly what we could propose in terms of like specific action items for council. Because I think in previous years, we talk a lot about like air quality. I think it's being in every single letter. But again, I feel like that's mostly jurisdiction of the county. And there were no specific items. We have talked about urban heat islands, which has never gotten much traction, I feel, with council, to be honest. There's a Cool Boulder project, but I think that was kind of like independent from our letters. And a couple more things, like I think a carbon economy measurement, which kind of sounds like a lot of what you guys have done with this inventory. But in terms of specific action items, I definitely need some guidance, or I think anything that you want to propose as well.
Well, I think we could kind of come up with a general topic and then dive into specifics. Like for me, one thing that came up in all this is transportation as an area of focus. I know that council seems perhaps receptive to some big pushes in the transportation areas. So that's like one area we could look at and open to other areas too. And then once we kind of decide on the area we want to talk about, then we get more specific. I don't know.
Do you know, Jonathan, how receptive council tends to be of kind of cross-cutting boards? You know, is it more favorable or less favorable to be sort of intertwined with something like transportation? Do they want us to be staying in our lanes for these letters? Because, you know, the Environmental Advisory Board, as you have mentioned many times, obviously overlaps with many others.
Yeah, it feels another lane, so.
I would encourage you to be bold with your recommendations. I wouldn't worry about stepping on any toes with other boards. I think you can craft a letter that is thoughtful, recognizing that there are boards that have purview over elements of transportation. And if transportation is the theme, you could think as a board about what do you want council to do with transportation?
Right.
What's the ask? Again, 2-year work program for council, policymakers, giving them some specific to-dos versus, because I think what has happened, and Heron, I appreciate the way you said that, it's been high level and generic, whereas a council member reads this letter, I'm like, yeah, air quality, of course I care about air quality, great, thank you. I don't know what to do with this.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's like, if there's a specific focus, it's council, we recommend really bringing together multiple departments to really kind of curate some ideas around achieving the transportation master plan and the climate objectives. I'm just making stuff up right now. I think those are the things that are based in a deep value, but it's also actionable within a time frame that a council member could be like, yeah, I could make that a priority.
And then real quick, logistically on timing, we don't have to write this in 20 minutes, right?
No. Now, the idea will be to like kind of discuss today, introduce the concept of the letter, what it is. Maybe brainstorm a little bit if we have time. And we will work on this letter separately, like the way we've done the previous years is we have a shared document
Okay,
and we edit it as we go.
Great.
So I would like to have some sort of draft by the next meeting perhaps, or at least have like the focus areas specified. And yeah, the letter will have to be submitted. Like our March meeting will be the one where we're like, okay, yeah, like we approve it. So yeah.
the other idea that I had, which I don't know if this works at all, is there anything around pushing council to do more at the state level? Because in terms of like where there's big lever points, I don't know if that's even within purview of. Just thinking about having the, you know, majority in the state level right now, that's conducive to stuff. Is there something there? I don't know, just brainstorming.
Love it.
I don't know the answer
I
to
would
that.
say, is there, I have two ideas and I would love to hear anybody else's ideas. And then we could kind of like talk about what, you know, is anything inspiring for all of us to, you know, to fill out and make more, you know, actionable or whatever. So, because I heard transportation, and from this conversation here, you know, one of the things that came to my mind was when we have an unstable environment, i.e., you know, everybody's COVID and it's all up in the air, suddenly something like RTD suffers because they can't seem to move as quick. But I'm fascinated by this idea of a company called Swift Rails. And they have an idea of creating rail systems that have little light cars on them. So it's like a light rail, but it's actually light, not 100,000 pounds or whatever it is for a train. That could be used. I read somewhere that there was a gondola idea between the Hill area and like with the new conference center and downtown Boulder. And I think the Swift Rails would be a better idea, you know, but I don't know the research. I don't have the background. So it's something that, you know, I would love to throw out there as a transportation concept, to have more systems in place that can handle higher loads than buses that are on roads, but it's also a very costly, potentially costly in the beginning. Two, the other idea was something around building codes and being really progressive with what kind of city do we need to be for the future, considering higher heat, more potential for flood, more potential for fire. So, you know, if we were in Florida, you know, there's a place called Babcock Ranch where they built a neighborhood that had a huge solar farm and it's completely what's the word? Storm resistant. And so it got a direct hit a couple years ago, very minimal damage. So can we work with the city code, building codes to allow people to start making things more environmentally friendly, doing something more with passive solar, passive heating, something that's more fire resistant. I hear people say one of the reasons why we can't innovate with our building is because codes prevent it. And can we be more forward-looking and less restrictive? Like, I think it's great to have more EV parking spaces, but in a way that's restricting people as opposed to opening up the availability of what we can do on an individual or whatever basis. So those are my two ideas. And yeah.
I'd be willing to draft some stuff on my ideas just to give something to work with, or the transportation at least, of like what. One thing to think about with the Swift Rails, I think it was called. It's 2
Yep.
years. This is like a 2-year plan, so that seems like a larger scope. So kind of thinking about like what's a reasonable 2-year.
I mean, if people were into it, it could certainly be let's research it, put that on the plate to have transportation. And maybe Jonathan, maybe there's people in transportation that could look at it and say, not a good idea. Okay, let's drop it. But
Yeah, my gut is it isn't realistic just in terms of like how costs and culture change and how long it's taken us to explore the light rail from Boulder to Denver.
Yeah,
that are within the budget of the city
Yeah,
that are attainable.
yeah.
well, so actually the difference though is that Swift Rails, like I've talked to them a couple times, and the cost of doing a Swift Rails installation is about twice as much as a cost of building a road currently. So it's not extravagant. It's not it's costly, but not to the level of what a light rail system cost is.
Do they require like certain amounts of open space along the railway?
No, because it's above. It's just like a gondola. It's mounted, on structures that lift the vehicles up above the road. So, yeah. But let's hear other ideas. Really, is my.
Oh, I didn't know because I know we have another item to get through. Do we, should we be putting together a document where we each put down a few ideas with some kind of basic overview, individual research we've done, and then
I can
as a group go from there?
I can create a document and share it, and then we can like tailor it, maybe choose maybe 3-4 items. I would like to read just 1 page.
Yeah.
So it's easy to read, digestible.
Wait,
And I agree that when I was saying each of us bring forward ideas for us to discuss, but then I think focusing and choosing one together, kind of voting on one to focus on, and then hitting the points, as Jonathan mentioned. I don't think we should be having a smattering of ideas in the letter, but I think giving everyone the opportunity, including Brooks, and she's not here, to get their ideas out there so we can all agree upon.
I'd be comfortable with up to three things.
Okay.
Just like a trinity. 3 is always like,
Yeah.
And then you can like.
3 is a nice number.
3 separate things?
Three ideas, or like,
one idea with like a few examples of like metrics they can
Three
hit.
focuses. So I think like we should like, I can create a document, we can put in there our priorities, and then we can just eliminate the ones that we don't agree on. And ideally, like three things, three topics. Like, okay, these are the action, this is the problem or what the community wants or what we want. This is the action item. This is another thing we want or the community wants. This is the action item. And then this is what the community wants, and this is the action item.
Do you feel like that would be received well, where they can choose one of three, or do you think it's better to have one and just?
No, I think it's fine.
Okay.
They don't have to adopt all of them. If they find one thing and want to move on it, that's great. The other thing that it's really nice to kind of cross-reference is the work plan that we know is going to be happening, and maybe shaping it in a way that maybe isn't already in motion. So just, and I know we got other stuff, so I'll just make this quick. So Greg's comment about codes, it's an intriguing one to be able to say, we're moving forward with the energy code update in a month. We are researching our building code to really look at embodied carbon and really thinking about how we use our package of codes to achieve our desired outcome in terms of our buildings and our built environment. What would you want to say to council as they think about this package of code adoption as we go through prioritizing X, Y, and Z, really thinking about aligning around specific environmental outcomes, addressing issues that we don't normally think of in terms of ecosystems, and using different tactics to achieve certain code requirements like Greg was talking about. We don't normally think about cooling, like achieving specific cooling load requirements that is done with technology and HVAC with things like trees. So what about a tree preservation ordinance that extends over into private properties versus just public properties? So you could say, look at the suite of code adoption that is coming forward with an eye towards the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, which is being updated in 2 years. That's a really important, really important policy document that we need to be aligning all of our code and all of our decisions towards in the next year or so. So that could be a really interesting thing to really emphasize in our policy work.
So gentlemen, could you compile like the work plan that the council is kind of heading towards and the things they're gonna encounter in the next year or two, so we can also like use that as a, because I mean, if we go for things that are somewhat tangential to things that are already gonna be discussing, it might help us, you know, shape some policies there.
Yeah, and it isn't council's work plan, it's the city's work, it's the departmental work plan. So we have an idea of like 118 high priority must-dos that I think would really give you a starting point to say across the departments, here are some things that are in motion. Yeah, I can work on.
I don't know if you want to answer this question, but is there anything that would be, you as the climate department needs more support behind to get in front of council that would be supportive?
It's funny you ask that because, you know, I'm reluctant to do that. I don't want to be self-serving, but what I will say is I think there are some citywide priorities that if they were elevated to council's level and put before them, what I don't want to do is like use the board and the board's letter to get to council to then direct action or work plans of other departments that maybe I'm not getting support from. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Right.
But I do think there's a whole other area of resilience that really needs to be elevated. We need to reboot our resilience strategy in the next year.
Yeah.
And we had a resilience strategy in 2016. It's a great document. It needs some dusting off. It needs some updating. It needs some integration across the city organization. And I know I've talked with council members who are eager. I know that our city leadership is eager. It needs a nudge.
Yeah.
I think my only idea so far that actually relates to the next item, which was the 6A, the boards and commissions recommendations. I would like to include in the letter that as they rethink, as they think like how to restructure these boards to kind of like what we would like the environmental board to be. I mean, we're talking about how when it comes to housing and transportation, environment is also important and plays a role. So how can we make sure that the input from the board also gets to those boards as well? Like I would like them to start thinking about that. perhaps if we're being ambitious, like update the charter. Like I don't know if you guys know, the charter for the Environmental Advisory Board, it's from the 70s, right? Eighties. It dictates like our purview is like waste management and ecosystems. And there's not a climate is not mentioned once in that charter. So I think we could ask, like, hey, these are like recommendations from the board. Like, we know you guys are thinking about this, and you're gonna be restructuring how these boards work. This is how we would like our board to be. This is how we envision it to be and its mission in this, this century, basically, like updated to our needs currently. So that's something like I would like to, I can write about, I can put in a document as well. Really
Do you
doesn't.
think the letter's the right spot for that, or is it part of what they're reviewing?
I think will be good. I mean, it's part of it's just like a letter that we send to council with their policies and priorities for the next 2 years.
Okay.
I think the letter's also like one of our few opportunities that we get to like, as a board, have a voice, as opposed to like one of us showing up at a council meeting and speaking as a board member, but that doesn't carry as much
Like more
weight.
like
I don't
us.
think, got it, cool. Is my assumption.
And to the idea of like just one idea versus 3 or more, I think like my goal will be to like, they're not like there multiple council members. If we propose more than one, we may get like support.
On different ones.
Yeah, like somebody may champion transportation, somebody may champion, oh, this idea, like that resonates with me.
Mhm.
So like a little bit, kind of like a spaghetti kind of thing and see what sticks, but also like targeted, like there's a sweet, some sweet balance there, but.
Sure.
You said something about a resiliency strategy that board has, Jonathan. Is that something you could send to us? Or is it just the stuff? It's 2 pages, that's all.
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, it's very long. Yeah.
So it's almost 8, guys. I think in terms of like, just to wrap up this conversation, yeah, I'll create a document. Jonathan, if you could send us the work plan, and then we can start like just iterating on this document. In terms of item, old business, I don't think we have anything right now. Item 6A, boards and commissions recommendations. All I wanted to say is that I would like to include our recommendations in this letter. So I don't think I have anything else to say about that, just what I just said a little bit ago. So Jonathan, if you wanna go ahead with 6B and create and talk about the calendar, if there's anything to discuss there.
Yes. So just a few things to put on your radar and know that I'm going to be scheduling a few things for the board. Tomorrow night, there are 2 items that if you wanted to pay attention to them, one was the community survey results. So there'll be a presentation from the consultant to council tomorrow night. Again, this was a survey that was done. We do it typically every few years. We hadn't done one since 2018. So it just talks about trends. Not much in there that I think is super relevant. Normally there's a lot around environment and climate and so forth, but most of the airtime was around safety, homelessness, housing, and a lot of the things that people are concerned about. The other item that's on tomorrow night is an update on the facilities master plan. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. So we'll be talking to council tomorrow night just about this long-term plan around maintaining our buildings well, thinking about orienting around climate and resilience more deliberately. So tomorrow will be a good conversation with them. And then there'll be an opportunity to bring that back to you for any potential changes or recommendations. On the look ahead, we did have some items that were scheduled, but we had to juggle them around. I need to land on when our actual energy code is going. I don't even know now. It is going back to council for first reading. Obviously, you all had a chance to provide some input to Carolyn and the team there. We've had a lot of discussion with stakeholders about affordability. That's been one of the concerns and just issues related to some of the requirements in the energy code, obviously, with respect to driving gas out of the portfolio, what that looks like. So we feel really good about what we're bringing forward to council, talking to council members individually about that. Couple of the other items that I just wanted to flag for you, we will be bringing an update to you all a little bit connected to tonight's conversation. our partnership with Excel Energy. This was our new partnership after we abandoned, or say abandoned, we set aside our municipalization effort in 2020. Big piece of it is tied to their emission reduction targets that we set for them. We said, as long as you meet these targets, that's great. If you don't, then we can exercise an out of the franchise and go back to municipalization if we choose. So we want to bring forward some information about their emissions targets and the partnership in general. We will be taking that update to council sometime in the first quarter, hopefully as well. Boulder Social Streets, there's going to be a discussion that hasn't been calendared. Love for the board to weigh in on that piece.
What is Boulder Social Streets?
Boulder Social Streets was really kind of the outpouring from the closure of West Pearl, where people really enjoyed having more kind of, what is it? What's the term? It's got a really bizarre term. Just utilizing public spaces in different ways. But also, right outside the tea house this past summer, there were Fridays that it was like, bring your dog down, or it was skateboarding. And so we want to expand that into other parts of the community. And I think there's some real value in having you all think about some elements that should be included as its design as it continues to roll out. Update on Excel Energy, and then we'll be scheduling time to come back to you on any recommendations that we take on the noise ordinance and gas leaf blower discussion. So
Can't wait for that one.
ugh,
I'm strong thoughts.
yeah, interesting one for sure. And it's a tough one, right? But we'll have to see also, we want to push that out just a little bit because we know that there's some legislation making its through right now that may, depending on how it goes, could address the issue for us.
Like incentive, like monetary, like,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. The tricky part is, do you ban the use? Do you ban the sale? How do you deal with the equity issue, which is, what is the real problem? It's being put out there as a climate issue. It's really not much of a climate issue. It's a noise pollution issue.
does hurt pollinators though.
What's that?
It does hurt pollinators.
True. Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree. But going to electric isn't necessarily going to change that impact. So people are like, we just need to electrify everything. They still make sound. So what's the real problem that we're trying to solve? How do you enforce it? So we did this amazing study. You all, I don't remember if you were on the board yet when we had,
It was like the week before I got here.
it was our consultant.
Because I
that did the
remember hearing
analysis.
about it.
It was
right
fascinating.
afterwards.
So
So yeah, basically it wasn't a climate issue, like the pollution from gas leaf blowers was like nothing, it was like pretty small. And they consulted the community, they consulted a lot of like landscape workers, and basically like, even one of them contacted me directly and said, like, hey, I talked to my provider and this is how much it will cost me to switch my fleet to electrical. And it was like 4 times or something. It was ridiculously expensive and they don't last as long. So they were like, and then like we're talking about equity too, because if somebody's using gas leaf blowers, they're gonna be most likely statistically a migrant worker. And then if we make it an offense, then the police can go. So now you're putting the migrant worker against the police. And so the technology wasn't there, the cost was prohibitive, there was an equity issue. So overall, it didn't seem like a ban was the right approach.
Yeah.
I don't know, what was the staff recommendation at the end? It was like I can't remember what was the final.
yeah,
And the
and
memo.
just to some of the points you raised, what we realized is that the technology is there. You just require like the charging.
The
When
charging.
they're in the field all day long can be a little bit tricky, so you have to have extra batteries, which is an added expense for sure. And, the health implication is a big one. We do care about that. And so for the workers themselves and the ozone impact, I mean, those are big. And so we do want to deal with the pollution issue. Our recommendation was to not do a ban right now. And I think it came to a lot of people's surprise that we didn't recommend a ban. To do a little bit more analysis and then to see what's going to happen at the state, because they are looking at a ban on use. Our recommendation is will likely be that we can ban the use during certain times. Hot summer days where you actually do have a pretty significant ozone impact. But otherwise, yeah.
Was xeriscaping part of that discussion at all, or is it just
Yes.
focused on?
I think it was.
Yeah, it was.
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, so how do we start to, rather than just saying, let's just figure out how to deal with all the grass clippings, why don't we think about a more holistic approach to overall landscaping and more xeriscaping, more climate friendly landscaping practices that you don't have to go and mow. When I think my quote that made it in the paper was something to the effect of, if the only feet touching your lawn or yours when you mow it, we have a problem, or something to that effect. It was a question about turf and public spaces. So anyway. That's my report. That's what we have.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, so I think the last item on the agenda, well, I guess just saying that the next meeting is scheduled for February 7 at 6 p.m. And with that, I put forth a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Thank you. We're done.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Greg.
From the, banning